Water pours from a solid rock. Bread falls from the sky like morning frost. A mountain shakes. You start to see something the administrative reading completely misses. This book is not a census. It is an autopsy. It is the detailed, heartbreaking record. Every single person, 20 years old and upward, the entire generation that walked on dry ground through a divided sea, will never taste the grapes they saw on that wooden pole. They will die in the sand. They will march in endless, blistering circles until their bones are buried under the dunes. The promise remains, but they will not be the ones to claim it. But this tragedy is not confined to the ancient borders of Canaan. Because the grasshopper complex did not die in the desert, a man who spends 2 decades inside a concrete cell will often walk out of the heavy iron gates and immediately shatter a storefront window. He does not want to go back to the violence of the cell block. But the infinite choices of the open road are paralyzing. The concrete walls are miserable, but they are familiar. The daily schedule is brutal, but it is entirely predictable. When a human mind is conditioned by captivity, freedom does not feel like liberation. It feels like a free fall. We see this in modern psychology, in the vicious cycles of addiction, in the way a person will systematically sabotage a peaceful relationship because the absence of conflict feels too alien to trust. This is the exact psychological reality operating beneath the text of the Book of Numbers, of how an entire generation of people stood on the exact border of everything God had promised them, looked across the valley at what it would. The Israelites are physically out of Egypt. But Egypt is not yet out of them. They are standing at the edge of Canaan, looking at fortified stone walls and tall men, and their nervous systems regress completely to the mud pits of Goshen. They do not calculate the military odds of victory based on the Red Sea miracle they witnessed just months prior. They calculate their odds based on 400 years of generational trauma, where a raised hand always meant a falling whip, and rebellion always ended in blood on the dirt. We are a species that will almost always choose a familiar misery over an unfamiliar freedom. When given the choice between the terrifying responsibility of moving forward into the unknown or the comfortable predictability of our own chains, we will reach for the chains. We will complain about the weight of the iron against our skin, but we will willingly wrap it around our own wrists, because the iron tells us exactly who we are. The Israelites complain about the divine bread tasting like nothing, and they actively romanticize the leeks and onions they ate while their own children were being thrown into the Nile River. The greatest threat to their future is not the giant standing in the valley. It is the slave living in their own minds, cost to step into it, and chose to die in the sand instead. They had the numbers. They had the visible presence of God sitting like a... God realizes that a generation forged in captivity cannot inherit a free world. They will constantly try to turn the promised land into another Egypt. They will build the exact same systems of oppression they just escaped, because oppression is the only architectural language they know how to speak. The slave mentality cannot be bargained with, and it cannot be reformed. It must be buried. And so, the wilderness becomes a massive 40-year graveyard. They walk in endless, dusty circles beneath the blinding sun. The men who dropped the grapes at Kadesh Barnea grow old and frail. The women who wept in the tents breathe their last. The bodies are lowered into the sand, one by one, until the entire population of that first massive census has vanished into the earth. But as the old generation dies off, something else is growing quietly in the background. A child takes a first step in the sand. A teenager learns to grip the hilt of a bronze sword. A young man watches his father breathe his last inside a goat hair tent, buries him under the dunes, and walks back out into the blistering sun. For 4 decades, the desert operates as a brutal, relentless filter. The old generation dies coughing in the dust. The new generation rises, walking in the light. These younger men and women do not know the whip. They do not know the mud pits, towering pillar of fire in the middle of their camp. They had the prophecy. And yet, of those 603,000 fighting men, they do not know the crushing, systemic fear of the Egyptian empire. They were born in the wild. They learned to walk, tracking a divine cloud. They grew up eating bread that materialized on the desert floor like frost. They drank water that violently split open solid granite. They know exactly one thing: God speaks in the midbar, and the earth obeys. The 40 years were not a punishment designed to break them. They were an incubation designed to rebuild them. The timeline jumps forward. Numbers chapter 26. The wanderings are over. The camp stops moving. They stand on the plains of Moab. The air here is different. It smells of damp earth and river water. The Jordan River rushes through the valley below. Right across the water, sitting like a fortress on the horizon, is the city of Jericho. Moses is 120 years old. He stands before the congregation one last time. He unrolls a new animal skin scroll. He calls the tribal leaders. He counts Reuben. He counts Simeon. He counts Gad and Judah. He counts 601,000. 730 men of fighting age. The number is almost identical to the census taken 40 years prior. The mathematical strength of the nation has not changed. Counted on that first scroll. Exactly. 2 will survive to see the inside of the promised land. 2. The question is, why? Why does God dismantle? But the psychological reality of the men standing in the ranks has shifted completely. This second scroll is not a ledger of survivors. It is the birth certificate of a free nation. They look across the rushing water. They see the fortified walls of Jericho. They know the Canaanite giants are still walking in the valleys. They hear the exact same reports their fathers heard at Kadesh Barnea. They do not flinch. They do not weep in their tents. They do not scream at Moses. They do not pick up stones. They stand shoulder to shoulder in the damp wind of Moab. They look at the obstacles that terrified their parents. And they wait for the trumpet to blow. They are ready to cross the river. The physical border of Canaan was crossed over 3,000 years ago, but the spiritual border of Kadesh Barnea still exists. A heavy cluster of grapes dripping sweet juice into the dry dirt of Kadesh Barnea. That is the image I keep coming back to. When I read this book, 1 million people standing inches away from the end of their story, looking at the physical proof of God's goodness, and choosing the familiarity of their chains over the terrifying responsibility of freedom. They had the promise, but they did not have the posture to carry it. If you are in a season where it feels like you are walking in endless, blistering circles, if you have been standing at the edge, the most powerful empire on earth, to bring 1 million people out of chains, walk them right up to the door of their destiny. And then, of a transition, a new calling, a healing, a relationship, a freedom you have prayed for. But every time you look across the valley, all you can see are the giants. You feel the anxiety tightening in your chest. You feel the overwhelming urge to run back to whatever Egypt you just escaped, simply because the pain of the past was predictable. While the hope of the future is unknown, your fear is not a military assessment of your future. It is the echo of an old captivity that God is trying to starve to death. We want the promised land immediately. We want the Red Sea to part. And we want to step right onto the fields of milk and honey. But God knows that if He hands Canaan to a mind that still thinks like a slave, that mind will simply build a new Egypt on holy ground. So He holds you in the midbar. He leads you into the quiet, uncomfortable acoustic chamber of the desert. You wake up to the same empty horizon, the same dry wind blowing against your face, the same brutal waiting. You pray for the destination, but all you have is sand in your shoes and a daily dependence on bread that you did not bake. It is so easy, in that liminal space, to assume you have been abandoned. It is easy to look at the towering walls of your circumstances and decide you are just a grasshopper waiting to be crushed. But the delay is not a divine. Let them wander in a brutal stacked, blistering circle for 40 years until their lungs give out. The answer changes how you read every delay in your rejection. It is a divine rewiring. He is letting the old coping mechanisms, the old defense structures, and the old panic die in the sand. He is systematically dismantling the slave inside of you. so that when you finally step across the rushing water of your own Jordan River, you are actually strong enough to hold the gift he is handing you. Do not despise the dry ground. The desert is doing a work the promised land never could, and that work echoes through every generation that follows. The sea splits to break an empire, and a nation walks through on dry ground. The mountain shakes with divine fire, and the blueprints for a sanctuary come down. The first census counts 1 million slaves, and the desert buries every single one. The scouts carry a heavy branch of fruit, and the camp chooses the heavy chains of fear. The wilderness burns for 40 years, and the slave mentality dies in the sand. The second census counts a new generation, and a free people stands on the plains of Moab. The trumpet blows at the edge of the river, and a nation finally steps into its destiny. Same desert, same God. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the 2 men who held the line at Kadesh Barnea, Caleb and Joshua. Own life. Because what happens between the first time Moses counts the people in chapter 1 and the second time he counts an entirely new generation? They stood in the exact same dust as the other 10 spies. They looked at the exact same fortified stone walls. They stared up at the exact same giants. But they were the only 2 men who remembered the size of the sea they had just walked through. They did not survive the wilderness because they had better military strategy. They survived because their memory of God was bigger than their fear of the present. If you are in a season where the walls of your circumstances look too high and the giants in your mind are screaming that you will never make it across the valley, stop evaluating the size of the opposition. Look back at the water he has already brought you through. The God who split the sea is the same God holding you in the sand, and he is preparing you for the weight of the promise. And may the God who has never once wasted a wilderness walk with you through yours and bring you out carrying a freedom you could not have received any other way. In chapter 26 is not just ancient history. God was not offering a bumper sticker. He was diagnosing something. He was exposing the terrifying difference between being physically extracted from slavery and being internally ready for freedom. To feel the weight of this tragedy, you cannot start with the math on the scroll, with the sound of a trumpet that no human breath is blowing. A sea splits in half to let a nation walk through on dry ground. You have to start with the title itself, because the name printed at the top of the page in your English Bible, it is the wrong name. The English title of this book comes to us through a long, quiet game of historical telephone. When Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek a few centuries before Christ, when they looked at those massive opening chapters, the lists of tribes, the tallies of soldiers, the headcounts of clans, and they named the text arithmoi, arithmetics, numbers. The Latin Vulgate followed suit centuries later with numeri, and English translators simply carried the tradition forward. But that was never what the original audience called it. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, a scroll is typically named after the first significant word in its opening sentence. If you unroll the Hebrew text of this book, the first line reads, "And the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai." The Hebrew name for the entire book is Bamidbar. It translates literally to "in the wilderness." This is not a book about mathematics. It is a book about geography. Specifically, the brutal, liminal space. Same God, same miracles, again and again. And yet, a man stands in the shadow of a goat hair tent, the desert wind blowing fine dust across, between where you used to be and where you were supposed to go. The Hebrew word for wilderness midbar is fascinating, all on its own. If you look at its 3-letter etymological root, DBR, you find the Hebrew word dabar, and dabar means to speak or a word. To the ancient Israelite mind, the desert is not just a physical location filled with venomous snakes, cracked earth, and empty horizons. The midbar is the place of the dabar. It is the place where God speaks. When all the noise of the Egyptian empire is stripped away, when the rhythm of the brickyards is broken, when you are surrounded by nothing but wind and silence, the wilderness becomes a massive acoustic chamber. The wilderness is not a punishment. It is a classroom. God pulls his people into the quiet so he can rewire their minds. deliberately dismantling the slave mentality that was beaten into them for 400 years. Over the first 10 chapters of Bamidbar, he gives them laws. He gives them a new calendar. He hands them the architectural blueprints for a portable sanctuary, ensuring the smell, his leather sandals, unrolling a heavy animal skin scroll. The air smells of campfires and unwashed bodies. He is counting. Of incense and burning offerings will anchor their camp, so his presence can literally walk in the dirt among them. He is trying to turn a fractured, traumatized group of refugees into a holy priesthood. And for those early chapters, it appears to be working. They build the tabernacle. They organize their tents by tribe. They finally pack up the camp at Mount Sinai and begin the long march toward the land of Canaan, moving as one cohesive unit beneath the shadow of a divine cloud. But the true test of a classroom is never the lecture. The test is what happens when you finally have to apply what you heard. And that test arrives 11 days later, at the edge of a valley. When they get their very first look at the promise, they march. The silver trumpets blow. The Levites hoist the Ark of the Covenant onto their shoulders. The cloud lifts from the tabernacle and drifts north. 1 million people pack their belongings, strap leather to their feet, and follow. The terrain shifts. The sharp red granite of Sinai fades into rolling limestone ridges. The blistering dry heat softens. The wind carries a faint trace of moisture. The smell of distant vegetation. They arrive at the oasis of Kadesh Barnea. He counts the tribe of Reuben. He counts Simeon. He counts Gad and Judah. 603,000. 550 men of fighting age. This is the border. Just over the next ridge lies Canaan, the land promised to their ancestors, the destination of their entire desperate escape from Egypt. They are 11 days removed from the mountain of God. They are exactly where they are supposed to be. Moses gathers the leaders, 12 men, one prince from each tribe. He gives them a simple directive: go up into the Negeb, walk into the hill country, look at the land, look at the people, look at the dirt, bring back some fruit. They disappear into the northern hills. The camp waits for 40 days. A nation sits on the precipice of its own destiny. Mothers nurse infants in the shade of goat hair tents. Old men whose backs carry the thick, raised scars of Egyptian whips stare at the horizon. The heat shimmers off the sand. The anticipation is a physical weight in the air. Then, the scouts return. You can see them walking down the ridge. They are carrying a heavy wooden pole across their shoulders. Slung between them is a single cluster of grapes, so massive it requires 2 grown men to lift it. The dark purple fruit shines in the desert sun. They bring pomegranates. They bring figs. The land is exactly what God promised. The crowds gather. The elders step forward. The excitement breaks like a wave across the thousands of families. It is a staggering number. A nation born from the mud pits of Egypt, composed of slaves who spent their lives making bricks for a mad king, standing in the dirt. But then, 10 of the 12 men open their mouths. They speak of giants. They speak of the sons of Anak. They describe walls that reach up to the sky. They speak of cities fortified with impenetrable stone. They look down at their own hands, and then look out at the crowd, and describe themselves as grasshoppers standing next to monsters. The panic spreads like a contagion. The people weep. The shouting begins. The failure is not a lack of weapons. It is a lack of identity. They have been out of chains for over a year, but the men standing in the dust of Kadesh Barnea are still breathing like slaves. They look at the towering walls of Canaan and instantly forget the towering waves of the Red Sea. But the detail that reveals the true tragedy of this moment is not found in the size of the giants. It is buried in the specific Hebrew word Moses used when he told them to cross the border in the first place. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 20, God gives Moses the command that launches the expedition. He says, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel." Because of the English translation, we carry an assumption. We assume God is sending a reconnaissance team to evaluate enemy fortifications, to assess troop strength, and to determine tactical feasibility. We think this is a military operation, but the word "Your English Bible" now standing in military formation. They are ready to march. Most people assume this book, the fourth book of the Bible, is exactly what its English title implies. Translates as "spy out" is the Hebrew verb tur. It appears repeatedly in this chapter, and its nuance changes the entire assignment. Tur does not mean to gather military intelligence. It means to tour, to survey, to seek out what is excellent. Years later, when Joshua sends actual tactical spies across the river, into Jericho, the Hebrew text uses a completely different word, meraglim, meaning men who walk on foot to uncover weaknesses and vulnerabilities. God did not tell Moses to send meraglim. He told him to send men to Tur. He was not asking them to evaluate if the land could be conquered. He was asking, want them to explore the beauty of the gift he was handing them. If seeing the original language dismantle a story you thought you knew is stirring up something inside you, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe. Because every week, we dig beneath the English text to find the truth hiding in plain sight. So the 10 men stand in the dust of the camp, the heavy purple grapes dripping sweet juice, onto the dry earth, and they refuse to tur. Instead, Numbers 14:36 tells us they bring back a dibba. A dibba is a whispering, a defamation, a slander. It is the same exact Hebrew word used in the book of Proverbs for a malicious rumor designed to destroy a reputation. The 10 men do not just bring back bad news. They slander the promised land itself. And by extension, they slander the character of the God who promised it. They look Numbers. They assume it is a dry, administrative ledger, a book you inevitably skip in February during your annual reading plan because it feels like at the towering stone walls. They look at the physical size of the Canaanites, and they decide the God who just drowned the most powerful army on earth in the Red Sea has somehow brought them here to be slaughtered. They take a mission of discovery and turn it into a mission of defamation. Their report is not a military assessment. It is an act of spiritual treason, and that treason creates a psychological collapse that ripples through the entire nation. Because when you forget the size of your God, the size of your enemy becomes the only thing you can see. Night falls over Kadesh Barnea. The camp does not sleep. Instead, a low, collective wail rises from the goat hair tents, echoing against the limestone cliffs in the dark. Men tear their tunics. Women weep into the dirt. By sunrise, the bitter grief has calcified into something far more dangerous. It has turned to rage. 1 million people stand in the desert, look at the towering pillar of fire, and decide they would rather go back to making bricks. They look at Caleb and Joshua, the only 2 spies holding the line. The only 2 men insisting the land is a gift waiting to be received. The crowd bends down. They wrap their fingers around heavy, jagged rocks. You can hear the stones grinding against each other in the dry morning heat. They are preparing to murder the only men telling them the truth. And then, the glory of the Lord flashes at the tent of meeting, reading a tax document from the Bronze Age. But if you look closer at the geography, at the fear, at the physical bodies left buried under the dunes, the narrative slows down to a devastating crawl. God speaks to Moses, and he pronounces the sentence. The judgment is not a sudden, unpredictable lightning strike of divine anger. It is the quiet, devastating echo of their own voice. The people had screamed the night before, "Would that we had died in this wilderness." God answers from the cloud, "As I live, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness." For 40 days, the spies walked the land. For 40 years, the nation will walk the desert. 1 year for every day of slander. They suffer from what we might call the grasshopper complex. They said it themselves when they delivered their report. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. And so, we seemed to them. The giants did not call them grasshoppers. They called themselves Grasshoppers. This is not a failure of military strategy. It is a collapse of identity. They look at the giants, and they shrink. They look at the walls, and they crumble. They look at the freedom God is handing them, and they reach backward for the whips of Egypt. They let the projected fear in their own minds dictate the reality of their future. And in doing so, they lose everything.